Say when. Are we going now?
Yeah.
Okay. Last week, we went over what we called action groups, and we went from the feudal era up to today and the last presidential election. We asked what was the deepest division in American society still? Black and white. What's the source? Feudalism. This is a post-industrial society. We have the deepest division going back to the feudal era. History is still there. We now have, for example, Trump is fighting with an egalitarian and mixing a populist appeal to everyone. At the same time, a strong leader is a big theme you have heard in the presidential election and debates. The need for a strong leader we will be hearing for 4 years. And was it invented by Trump? No. He's fighting with Putin and the Chinese. Who was the only leader who conquered China and Russia, both? Genghis Khan. Okay, who is the model? If we listen to some of the speeches, we get none of these here, but we get a little bit sometimes from stuff translated from Putin, but we want to look at the background with Genghis Khan. We ready for the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
Were executed, while the non-aristocrats were invited to join his ranks.
Wait, sorry.
He delegated tribes were executed, while the non-aristocrats were invited to join his ranks. He delegated authority based on skill and loyalty, rather than tribal affiliation or blood. As an incentive, Temujin promised civilians and soldiers a portion of the war spoils. His new rules laid the foundations of a code of law which would eventually be developed and applied to his empire. His father's death influenced Temujin, and one of the laws was that hospitality was sacred. Guests and envoys should not be harmed. Temujin revolutionized the steppe world. Each victory brought more warriors to his side, and he reformed the Mongols into an army. The decimal system was implemented, and the army was divided into tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Transfers between the units were forbidden, and if one man deserted, the other 9 in his unit were put to death. Commanders were chosen by their men, except for the commanders of the 10,000s, so-called tuners, who were handpicked by the Khan himself. This chain of command allowed flexibility, discipline, and loyalty, and was vital to performing sophisticated maneuvers. Every able-bodied man had to be a part of this structure. In 1201, a number of opposing clans called a council, Kurul.
That's the first clip.
We have some, okay, you got 2 or 3 sections there?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, fine, go on to the next.
sure.
In 1213, when the Mongols invaded again, their mobility prevented the Jin from organizing a successful resistance as their countryside was raided. The Mongols began besieging multiple fortresses and cities and waited for the enemy to attempt to break the siege, only to be ambushed and defeated. The Mongols were fighting guerrilla warfare within a foreign land. The cities that surrendered had most of their inhabitants murdered or enslaved. However, engineers, artisans, merchants, doctors, teachers, priests, and administrators were spared and asked to join the Mongol horde. Many others were taken and used as meat shields for the following sieges, marching in the vanguard to block arrows or discourage the archers from firing. After securing all Jin land north of the Yellow River, Gengis moved against the capital of Beijing and besieged it. The Mongols tried to starve the city out, but after a few months, an epidemic spread through their camp, and they had to negotiate with the Jin Emperor Xuanzong. He agreed to peace in exchange for a tribute of loot, men, horses, and his daughter, along with subjugation to the Mongol Khan. Thus, the Mongols left China and returned to Mongolia with their treasure. But just outside the Great Wall, a messenger galloped to Genghis Khan. The emperor had moved his court to Kaifeng to the south. This enraged the Great Khan, as it signaled that the Jin planned to retaliate. The Mongols quickly returned to Beijing and besieged the city with the help of thousands of Chinese engineers. The city was surrounded, breached, and razed. For weeks, thousands of carts hauled loot back to Mongolia. The fires in the city burned for over a month, while its people were massacred. What was once considered a nuisance had brought a 20 million strong nation to its knees. And now, the Mongol devastation was heading west. The Naimans were one of the tribes defeated by Genghis Khan in 1205. After the defeat, the prince of the tribe, Kuchluk, fled to the west. In 1208, he was defeated by Gengis yet again and found refuge in the nearby Western Liao Empire. He was welcomed and even married the daughter of the emperor Shiligu. 2 years later, Kuchluk rebelled against his father-in-law and took control of the empire. In 1216, Kuchluk attacked the city of Amalek, which was under Mongol protection. Genghis Khan sent him.
Next one is it? Yep, okay. 35, 30.
The Mongols restarted their offensive. The biggest, most prosperous Rus city, Kiev, was besieged in September. The envoys sent in were killed, and the city fell after a 3-month-long siege. All 50,000 locals were massacred. With the Rus principalities belonging to the Golden Horde, the Mongols now looked towards Central Europe. The Venetians delivered on their deal with Subutai.
Okay. The Russians were that weak in part because there was no nation. There were duchies, counts, divisions within Russia, but there was no Czar. The background, which that bit of history was salient in the mind of, through the 20th century, most important was Stalin. Stalin was invaded by the Germans. The major war that the Germans fought was not with the people in the West. That was nothing. The major battle for the Germans was the Russians. And the Eastern Front, so-called, was the hard fight. To fight back, how could Stalin mobilize against this Nazi German leadership? He wanted to mobilize in the same manner that Trump wants to mobilize the people. How could he mobilize the people to fight? He commissioned the two leading, this is a second theme you've heard in the course, the arts. He commissioned the leading film director, Eisenstein, and the leading musician, composer, Prokofiev, to make 2 films. The first was on Alexander Nevsky, who was a classic Russian hero who fought the Germans. And the gods were with them. They brought the Germans to attack across a huge lake, and they battled with the Germans, then headed over where the lake got thinner, and thousands of the Germans collapsed into the ice. That was the Alexander Nevsky defeating the West. That was in 1937, just as the Germans were clearly going to be a battle. 1944, the height of the war. I mean, think of Russia had been pounded in these battles in the middle of the war. What did Stalin do? Where did he allocate his resources? To make another movie. Another movie. It was called Ivan the Terrible. Ivan Gorsky, which is translated into English as the Terrible. The Russians call him the Formidable. Let's see a little bit of Ivan the Terrible.
The history wrapped in an enigma, as Russia has been called, is shown in all its majestic grandeur in Ivan the Terrible. Sergei Eisenstein's monumental work had been banned until recently. Now at last it can be shown in the complete version the director envisioned. Ivan the Terrible pursued his dream. A Russia freed from the enslavement of the selfish boyars. A Russia united and strong enough to withstand the traitors from within and the enemies from without. The friendly Ossetti, the raging intrigues, the fierce battles form the backdrop for the sweeping drama Eisenstein has fashioned with a power that has rarely been equaled. Prokofiev's operatic score adds depth and scope to the film which has been called a cinematic event.
Is this also local? The film Ivan the Terrible was launched, and I'll back up and say, in the third largest city, the largest, Moscow. Second was named after Peter the Great, called St. Petersburg. Aimed toward the West and bringing individualism, entrepreneurialism, some of the egalitarianism, which is within Russia. The third largest city in Russia is Kazan, which was built by the Mongols and their so-called Golden Horde, which that is, they were not ethnically narrowly defined, like the Roman army and its successes were based as did the Ottoman Empire. They both had the talent to recruit universalistically talented fighters. And they were Turks, they were from Iran, from Iraq, and if they fought well, they became part of the Golden Horde as they rode their horses. And they had tents that were gold in color, and they were called the Golden Horde for that reason. We left that out, but the capitals of Iran and Iraq killed more of the population of those two countries, which were not regained 500 years later until the late 20th century. So Genghis Khan, all the way far south, and is that alive in the role of Iran and Iraq right now, with the Israelis, of course, representing the West in the sense, with the West representing for the Russians in Ukraine. There's a massive number of things. That is the Ivan the Terrible, I think, was even have seen it, but was the spreading of this over the videos we have today. The Russians also have a tradition of ironically teasing. There are massive numbers of things which make fun of Zelensky, of Biden, of Trump, of the presidents of England, of Germany, and so forth. They're continually, especially Zelensky, is shown as drunk, drugged. Many of them are shown as gay in orientation, lying on beaches, mostly nude, and these are the people that the Russians. One of you asked the question: was there any social movement or opposition within Moscow? And I said, remember what I said? The most shocking that Putin then built upon substantially, and said, we do not want this in Russia. You're shaky. Remember?
Yeah, it was like the Russian public rallied behind Putin when there was like that incident in the Orthodox Church. The public found it disturbing.
And who was in the Orthodox Church who created this horrified public to learn about?
It was like a feminist movement called like the Pussy something. And
The
like,
Pussy Girls.
Pussy Girls.
That's not, those two words are not Russian. Okay. And that kind of message of the violation of the sanctity of the church was exactly the kind of seen as what is coming from the West. We don't want this in Russia. And this is, people are fighting today against the Ukrainians, not because it's just, well, because it could be part of Russia, but it is these Western views that are potentially there and potentially to bring down Putin, and this whole orientation of a hierarchy and which goes back to Genghis Kahn and more. The reasons to consider empires in this course is to make a simple, big point. Globalization is not simply capitalism and Wall Street. If you just read the first week that we discussed, nobody mentions Genghis Khan. It's Wall Street. Okay. The point is, there are many other ways that globalization was spread around the world long before Wall Street was invented. And we have a more powerful, more general concept we term here is hierarchy and egalitarianism. But these two things have been in battle for hundreds, thousands of years. And to try to make sense of this, how can we make sense of these which are going on? And right out this window, there were, a year or so ago, there were lots of tents. Many of you were still here. You walked right out these doors, and there were tents here for a month or so. Maybe you've read about some of these specifics of who were involved in this, but if we try to make sense of this, the person who probably brought most narrowly an interpretation, if you will, is for the U.S. is Daniel Elazar, as we'll talk about mostly in this section. But behind Elazar, and linking this to the rest internationally as well, was Max Weber. And Max Weber's Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism laid out the background for where and why Wall Street, entrepreneurialism, individualism, and how this made the West so different from the rest of the world. Even though India, China had much longer, stronger civilized countries and histories, they invented all kinds of subtle theologies. They invented, obviously, firecrackers, many other military aspects which were used following down from a Genghis Khan, if you will. But when I think the first Nobel Prize was given to an Indian economist only a few years ago. In his speech, he said, and asked, what was the most important invention of the 20th century? And you're getting the Nobel Prize in economics. If he were Chinese, if he were American, what would he have said if he were economist? Most important development through the 20th century. What would be one word? Yes?
Electricity?
Maybe. Some might say electricity. Anyone else?
The internet.
Internet? Maybe, but that's right at the end of the 20th century. So over the whole 20th century. Probably, yes.
Nuclear weapons?
Maybe, but if we think of modes of governance or modes of leadership and coordination among people, not just the physical sides, probably an economist or from China or from the U.S. or from the West is more likely to talk about the growth of the economy. We made the economy through entrepreneurship, competition, markets, and so forth as being successful. The Indian economist did not say economic growth. He said it was democracy. Democracy. How many people in China would have heard that? Okay. How many people in Russia would have heard that? No. The point is, how can we begin to see some of these differences in orientation around the world? That is, if we have lots of data, and I'll mention here, one more just to show not only these tents that were outdoors here. This next week there will be a presentation to the master's program in computational social science by 3 guys who are on the faculty at the Northwestern Business School. These 3 guys from the business school will come here, and what is their topic?
I didn't go.
It's for next week.
Oh.
The topic is moralism. What is moralism? And what they've done is to try to measure this with text and to count the World Wide Web data about moralism, even though this is part of economics. They're doing it. This is part of business. Businesses want to sell products. To understand the ideas behind is my point in these things. They're not, these are not simple physical things such having a car or a refrigerator or a nuclear weapon. The question is, who's going to use it and where and why and how? And where and how do these aspects of battles and wars which are going on in Israel, surrounding Israel, surrounding the divisions today. I'll go back and forth. I'll go back a little bit from Robert Bellah, Bellah, Berkeley professor, trained at Harvard, one of the leading sociologists of our time, identifies a range of cultural capacities such as communal dancing, storytelling, and theorizing, whose emergence made this religious development possible, deploying the latest findings in biology, cognitive science, and evolutionary psychology, he traces the expansion of these cultural capacities from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age, roughly the first millennium BCE, when individuals and groups in the old world challenged the norms and beliefs of class societies ruled by kings and aristocrats. These religious prophets and renouncers never succeeded in founding their alternative utopias, but they left a heritage of criticism that would not be quenched. Religion and Human Evolution from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age was the title of a book. And there's a series of others by others and him on the four great civilizations of the Axial Age: the ancient Israel, Greece, China, and India. All had existing religions, both prophetic and mystic, to be rooted in the evolutionary story that he pulls together. Human Evolution answers the call for a critical history of religion in the full range of human constraints and possibilities. Okay, so if these lead up in this broader axial age to show this is a perspective that comes from comparing these worldviews of what works, what's powerful. This in turn builds back to, as I mentioned, to Max Weber. His book, Ancient Judaism. And a quote, I'll bring in a couple of if you just scroll down a little bit more, just below that. Yeah, this is good, right here. Take a look at some of these words, and I'll read a few things because these are big enough you can see some of these things. He looks at the emergence of Jesus Christ, but Christ was one of many. That is, science begins with comparison. So you don't just look at one Jesus Christ. You say, Israel was flooded with people who were called prophets. Christ was in competition with other prophets. After the fall of the conquest, and look at hierarchy versus egalitarianism. In the 9th century, the great kings of Mesopotamia and those later of Egypt once again resumed their expansionist policy. Syria, heard of Syria these weeks, became a theater of hitherto unprecedented military events. Never before had the world experienced a warfare of the frightfulness and magnitude of that practiced by the Assyrian kings. Blood fairly drips from the cuneiform inscriptions. An impending gloom beclouded the political horizon. Classical prophecy acquired its characteristic form. That is, with this military domination, emerged something to fight against it. The pre-exilic prophets from Amos to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, viewed through the eyes of the contemporary outsider, appeared to be above all political demagogues and on occasion pamphleteers. Isaiah, for example, directed a pamphlet against Shebedi with a postscript against Eliakim, who in the belongings of the written curse which Jeremiah placed upon Semedish, the characteristics of the prophets as demagogues and pamphleteers. Okay, these are not just theologians. They were attacking the kings, attacking the leaders, attacking these most important people around them within Israel. apparently Isaiah preferred the public courtyard of the temple as a scene for his appearance. Scene, appearance. Finally, Jehovah commanded Jeremiah, "Go thou into the streets of Jerusalem and speak in public." As a rule, the prophet requested a divine world, but the prophet personally confronted also the king and his family in the street, spoke in public or through the unusual dictated word of a disciple, and had it circulated. The rule of those politically important, the predominant concern of the prophet was the destiny of the state and of the people. Hear this in the speech of Trump, the state and the people. The concern always assumed the form of emotional invectives against the overlords. It is here that the demagogue appeared for the first time in the records of history. It was about the period when the Homeric songs threw the figure of Thersites into relief. So he's beginning to move into the Greeks, and then the Greeks and the Israelis together forged into an individualistic, egalitarian foundation, which led to the Western world. The Christians and Jews were driven out of Israel, out of Jerusalem, and many ended in Rome, where this slave culture over the next few hundred years grew into the Roman Catholic Church, the closest version of an empire in the European Middle Ages. These legacies surround us today in war and peace. The main readings in the West are by social scientists on our reading list right here: Elazar, Lipset, Tocqueville. But these emerged in confrontation with hierarchies that we're talking more about today. These cultural conflict themes recur in later sections, like the new political culture book, which we've shown you bits of it. The classic measure of modern culture came from the 19th century nationalism. France and Napoleon were the most visible in his dramatic military success in conquering much of his crew out of the morale and egalitarian commitment of the army of citizens. They thought of themselves as citizens of the world and bringing the message of liberty, equality, and fraternity to everyone. In some ways, they were correct as we live today, far more than we do with the aristocratic inheritance of the kings which preceded. How to get there, the guillotine and killing off the old elite is still a classic option. Strong hierarchies, what the French generate, strong counter-hierarchies, like the guillotine, followed by another strong state as an ideal, at least which dominated France more than most of Europe up to the present time. On the continent, the major counter model was the British. Why did democracy emerge combined with egalitarianism? Many have sought to answer this from detailed study of the House of Parliament, which stressed an elite with their values of accepting specific rules of the game, like recognizing Her Majesty's loyal opposition, retaining a bit of tradition, such as the symbolic queen or king, but it was long in the weaker state than the French, when in 1066 the invasion of the Normans combined with the Saxons into another set of regional leaders. The Normans had their name from where? The Norsemen today would be Finland, Scandinavia. Sorry, the Scandinavians would include the Finns, the Norwegians, the Danes, and and Swedes. And they invaded as far south as southern Italy by water. How about France and England? They had lots of outposts, little villages and so forth up the coast of England, but especially in Scotland. Then they had a bit of France because France was still not coherent as a state. And out toward the edge of England, there was a region called Normandy, and so there we go. The Normandy, because they were Norsemen who settled predominantly there, and they were the invaders in 1066 with the Saxons, became the leaders of the what has become the United Kingdom. But they also built a sea-based empire. And this was the largest, the only largest geographic territory that exceeded the empire of Genghis Khan. It's the British Empire, including especially India, but South Africa, US, Canada, Australia, we were all part of the British Empire. Studies which have been done of this since historically have traced also bits of democracy and bits of things. Within England, you had these regional differences, things which could be linked with religions. So there was England had been part of the Roman Catholic background, but then the king wanted a divorce, so he said, we're throwing out the Roman Catholics. We're going to have a Church of England, and it will have rules which I, the King of England, will be able to say, yes, you can get a divorce. Nevertheless, this also made it a little more tolerant with that example, that even though they were building an empire, including within the U.S., for instance, and including New England as well, as this is the Elazar theme coming out, the British Empire sent people from southern England to the Boston area, New York, North and South Carolina. They all came from that same general southern part of England, but they nevertheless were three distinct religious groups. The New Englanders were within England were termed nonconformists, nonconformists to the Church of England, and they were in the famous works of Max Weber, who saw that in comparative perspective, he wrote about the ancient Jews, but he then linked this to, how did this fighting with the ancient Jews within Christianity? These views led to a Calvin French priest trained in Paris, saw that clearly he couldn't say anything which he was about to say, so he went to Switzerland, and they developed a strong Calvinist theological perspective. And the biggest difference from Roman Catholic Church was to be able to protest against the hierarchies. And Martin Luther had tried to do this, he started this, but he negotiated with the princes and others within parts of Germany, and he said, if you will adopt Lutheranism as your religion, and you can have a veto any of the ministers who are in your region. And the princess said, "Oh, okay, then we won't have to fight with the Pope, and we won't have military and economic control and political control." Calvin said, this is selling out to power. This is the hierarchy is there. We don't want that. If we're going to have new religious foundations, who has the Word of God? The people. You heard this recently? The people with the Word of God is that we will choose the leader, and the leader will be called alderman. And this term is used in Chicago today. We don't have city council members, we have aldermen. It really comes from a Dutch term, because the Dutch is predominantly, as I discussed the last few days, most of the Netherlands is Calvinist with a little bit of Catholicism down in the south, closer to France. So even there, the religious, it's not an ethnicity of, a genetic background of the Dutch. It's the religious organization which they joined together in. And the Dutch were there, and much of this seafaring exploration around the world was there ahead of the English. The Dutch created the Dutch East India Trading Company, and the English then took over from the Dutch, but the Dutch had been there first. Okay, and just to mention again, the background is roughly the same time. There was an Italian next to Venice. He's really Genovese, but he wanted to sail around. He came over to bits of he came over by water to Portugal, and the Lisbon naval folks, he learned more of their tricks and how to go further and further. And he said to them, I bet I could go all the way to China. If you'll give me the money, I'll give it a try. And the people in Portugal said, no, it's too much risk. You can't do that. So what did he do? He went to Spain. Yes. He went to Spain. And the Spanish said, okay, we'll give you the money and the ships in the background. What was his name? Christopher Columbus. Okay. So Christopher Columbus, we had, in this sense, the competition, this background, but the spreading of Catholicism then went to, and is today, extremely critical. Most across Latin America. The largest exception in the, and I mentioned the findings which we now have, is between Portugal and Brazil, the largest country in Latin America. And I mentioned as well, big point, on a Sunday today in Brazil, the largest number of people in a church is called evangelicals. The evangelicals are heavily represented in the national government, and they had a prime minister prior to Lula. Okay, so we had these battles which are there, and these globalization patterns were not unique, were not the same. I'm pointing to the big difference between the hierarchy in a strict manner of Genghis Khan and the English having a weaker leadership from the beginning, continued a more egalitarian tendency, so that within the English Empire, such as in South Africa, the colonial administrators, or within India, the colonial governors within India could then have some degree of autonomy within their region, within India, within South Africa. And one of the most, and then there were some people who, so then they were permitted, they permitted generally to permit the nonconformist church members to come to these countries And what did they do? They built churches. They taught people to read. They were illiterate in South Africa, or around most of Africa, much of the world. They taught people to read, and they learned the Bible. And they built churches which were called, they may have been called Baptist or Methodist, but basically they were Calvinist in this general inspiration, bottom-up orientation, and a federal kind of political system which led in the direction of democracy. So that one of the most extreme was in what is now called Bangladesh. It was part of Greater India, but the governor, what became Bangladesh, was permitting those persons to sing songs which were making fun and showing autonomy, challenging the British colonial administration itself. So the use of songs and prayers and little speeches and mixing of humor with irony with music was something which continues today within Bangladesh more than, by contrast, other parts of India. So the point is, these bits of combination of where egalitarianism was stronger in those parts of India, clearly, than, by contrast, in Iran or Russia or China. And of course, you see this today in places like the US, Australia, Canada, with England, fostering these ideologies, if you will, of democracy and egalitarianism. When coffee came to the West, it led to hundreds of London coffee houses where people would make drinks and would drink coffee and make bets, willing that the other might or might not be able to have a ship get back to London. They would make bets on it. And that in turn grew into insurance companies. They would then say, I'll put a little more money on you, a little more on that, and that in turn led to the London Stock Exchange. There were earlier versions in both cases in the Netherlands. They were more pure, if you will, as Calvinists, more egalitarian, more of a what later became termed a bourgeoisie. But it clearly was building the foundations of Wall Street. Using organizations linked to shipping to world markets. The British Navy became the most critical linkage in England for isolating England from invasion by the immediate geographic neighbors. The Germans most of all, with Hitler. The coffee houses permitted critically, and for a couple of centuries before, the coffee houses permitted critically important discussions where the pamphlets, like the works of John Locke, would be printed and debated, generating a potential secular foundation for democracy that was essential and is essential in the US, Canada, Australia, and spreads around further. By contrast, the continent words in major countries have authoritarian leaders that prohibited any such open discussion and publication. Through the 19th century in France or Germany, you couldn't do this. Organizations like civic groups were prohibited through most of the 19th century in France. Censorship of all publications and public meetings was supervised by inspectors. This is new stuff in much of the world, in continental Europe. So England was very distinct through these nonconformist churches, and it depended on the time period. There's different leaders within England, so sometimes there were nonconformist professors at Oxford and Cambridge, and then when the government changed, they fired all those nonconformist ministers, and they would get on boats, and they went to Cambridge and Boston and Salem. And that, in turn, as the story is told by Daniel Elazar, where did they go from these three places, the three cultures? How did that get across the U.S.? This is the part which the Americans most often focus on. Anybody tell us that? Okay, this is the American version. You know what that, we could draw a map up there. But yeah, I'll let you imagine a map. What happened to the people who were in Boston and Cambridge and Salem? Some of them would stay there, but others would head further west. Same thing in New York, same thing from the Carolinas. So as people moved from Mississippi to Oklahoma and to Texas, they picked up some cowboys in Texas. Some of that continues today. They had from Oklahoma, they had the Okies when they had a bad harvest, and the Okies the farmers couldn't do anything, so they got in little carts or whatever, and they went to Southern California along the way. The New Yorkers, same kind of pattern through the middle parts of the U.S., including southern Illinois. So within the state of Illinois, so Daniel Elazar was trained here at the University of Chicago, a political theorist in training. His father was a rabbi, and he wrote this tremendous, terrific book that within the state of Illinois we can find these three distinctive American political cultures, and they fight against each other. And they fight today, and they're fighting with Trump right now. Trump combines different aspects of these from the American South and the hierarchy part, which goes back to Genghis Kahn, if you will, but also has from the New England part, we have the social issues of feminist egalitarianism, and we have this spreading across to places like Seattle and Oakland, California. That's good. Yeah, that's good. Let's talk a little bit of this. I paid more attention to this in teaching this course, thinking about cities and where and how the cities link to these big differences. So we can talk about Putin, but as I introduced Putin, I said, what are the three biggest cities in Russia? They're drastically different in their own political cultures. 3 different cities. St. Petersburg, the West, Moscow, the power of the machine there, Kazan, oriented toward Mongolia. And I mentioned the films celebrating Alexander Nevsky to fight against the Germans, and Ivan the Great to fight against the other side. And each of these you can find within regions and activities and bits of culture in the history of Russia today. This is a terrific book. Let's just look at one or two things here. This is a bit small. You're sitting right up there. One of you two folks. Why don't you just read a couple of lines there from that tape to give us a flavor of that.
Was the first draft?
That's fine. Yeah.
In 1237, a vast army of Mongol horsemen left their grassland bases in the Kipchaks.
Yeah. You got. Let's put our cameras over there.
To the north of the Black Sea and raided the principalities of Kiev and Rus. The Russians were too weak.
Yeah.
The Russians were too weak and internally divided divided to exist, and in the course of the following 3 years, every major Russian town, with the exception of Novgorod, had fallen to the Mongol hordes. For the next 250 years, Russia was ruled, albeit indirectly, by the Mongol Khans. The Mongols did not occupy the central Russian lands. They settled with their horses on the fertile steppe lands of the south and collected taxes from Russian towns, over which they exerted their domination with periodic raids of ferocious violence.
Okay, so that's the domination, but it wasn't crude. I mean, they showed they destroyed and killed everybody in the current capital of the Ukraine, which was then Rus. The old Russian was the largest important city at the time, but there was no central leadership, and so the importance of the Czar, the creation of the Czar, is what Stalin was saying. We need violence, and we're going to fight those Germans who are fighting us again, and we will return with every bit of vengeance and power and violence if necessary. But this is all this is in the head of Putin today. Okay, and it's in the minds of the Ukrainians fighting back. They don't feature this on American television. Okay. But you've seen it here. It's not that complicated. It's right there. He then can you read a little bit on the next page as well?
According to the national myth, the Mongols came.
Myth, according to the national Russian myth, yeah.
Yeah, the Russian myth. The Mongols came, they terrorized and pillaged, but then they left without a trace. Russia might
They
have-
left without a trace. See that through the 19th century, that was the classic Russian story. Mongols, we're not okay. We defeated them. We now have a Czar. But go ahead.
Russia might have succumbed to the Mongol sword, but its Christian civilization, with its monasteries and churches, remained unaffected by the Asiatic wars. This assumption has always remained central to the Russians' identity as Christians. They may live on the Asiatic steppe, but they face towards the west. From Asia, wrote Dmitry Lukachev, the leading 20th century cultural historian of Russia, we received extraordinarily little, and his book, called Russian Culture, has nothing more to say on the Mongol legacy. This national myth is based on the idea of the Mongols' cultural backwardness. They ruled by terror, currently in Pushkin's famous space, neither algebra nor Aristotle with them when they came to Russia, unlike the Moors when they conquered Spain. They plunged Russia into its dark age. Kazan, in his History of the Russian State, did not write a thing about the cultural legacies of the Mongol world. For how, he asked, could a civilized people have learned from such nomads? The great historian Sergei Soloviev devoted just 3 pages to the cultural influence of the Mongols in his 28-volume History of Russia. Even Sergei Plamenov, this leading 19th century Mongol scholar, suggested that they would find.
Okay, so you get the sense. So was not big stuff for sure, but it has changed. But the author of this is English. He's an English writer who's specialized on. So he knows this stuff and he knows all the Russian sources, but he's writing about this very explicitly in ways that show the interpenetration of these things within Russia when you look more closely. And of course, you have today, we have mixed information. There are lots of people who don't want to fight, who say we shouldn't be fighting with the Ukrainians. That's part of Russia, but that's okay. That's our history. But there's individualism. I mean, so you have mixtures at the level of individuals, and we have mixtures at the level of tents, which are outside of this building. And they remember, of course, the presidents of Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia were all fired in conjunction with these investigations of U.S. Congress folks saying, what are you doing in these universities? Who's fighting whom? Why? What's happening? Etc. So these things are deep and fundamental. Can you call this in one word? Moralism. But that's a simple label, and what we do through the course is to start with that and to say, yes, this is we want to bring in things beyond money and guns and the computers. These things are generated and used by people who have ways of how to think about them, how to use them, and how they build. How did Trump get elected the first time? Did he have lots and lots of money which he spent? No, he spent almost nothing. He used this thing called Twitter. Someone else bought Twitter named Musk. And so having those 4 years when Trump was writing, his big policy statements with these 2-line, 3-line kinds of things, he didn't have a big program. He had little things. So but then later on he got censored. So clearly, Trump. So the background of Facebook, Twitter, X, and the differences within California, within Texas. Within Texas, you still have, as in within Russia, we have these 3 cities. Within Texas, we have Austin. Austin is more like Madison, Wisconsin, or Berkeley within California. It's the entrepreneurial, individualistic, egalitarian, ideologically charged kind of place. Or they have bumper stickers. Keep Austin weird. They called me up. They said, we advise us on how we can keep Austin more weird, okay, etc. Why do I mention these? Because these are found within individuals in our own heads. We may have an authoritarian side of us and a more egalitarian side within us. We can change with different people. We can change in different networks when we're with one branch of our family versus another branch of our family. Or as you're on a football team or a soccer team, people may play in a more egalitarian way when they're on the same team. And if they're teams together, they may also be in a fraternity together. So you may have little bits of these things get combined within campus divisions, even on this campus, and it's more so, of course, in choosing from one campus, one college, one university to another. So USC, University of Southern California, versus Berkeley. They're both within California. But I was teaching at UCLA because I wanted to see why LA was so different. And I went over to some meetings at the University of Southern California. And they were having a rally because they were going to fight in the football game against Berkeley. And they said, those people at Berkeley, all they do, these weirds, these nerds up there, they have their heads in their computers. They don't know how to get out there and play on the field. We do. We're here, and we don't care about nerds. We don't care about the books. We don't care about what's in your head. We want to know if your shoulders will hit them harder. Okay, so I'm not a hugely different, not just 1 or 2 people. The idea that the whole college, the whole University of USC was fighting against the team of Berkeley. Okay, so the point is, and talk to people who are on the faculty, who are students there today. These are Angelina Jolie went to USC, etc. Hollywood is the big industry in California, in Southern California, but it also is important around the world, and so it is also then fought. And I'll mention again briefly that the greatest novelist in the U.S. was hired by Sam Warner of Warner Brothers to work for something like $10 an hour or whatever at the time. Tiny fee, named William Faulkner. So he would rewrite. He didn't get to write. He did write one screenplay was published as a novel and became a film. But mostly he rewrote others' things And that's how he supported himself financially as a novelist, because he didn't sell enough of his novels, even though he's the greatest novelist. Recognized by Sam Warner, saying, "I'm proud of him. You know, he's leading novelist in America. I'm just paying him nothing in my shop." Okay, that style of the hierarchy within Hollywood, leading to nevertheless a combination of the art, the music, the dance, the combination of the heart that you can engage. Then Faulkner and others began to say, we can bring in the black film. We can say the bad is the good. We can have the hierarchy is being fought against by the egalitarians at the bottom. And so you had Bonnie and Clyde. And what did they do for a business? Who knows about the film? What did they do for a business? They robbed banks. They were bank robbers, and they fought, and they would run away in their cars. They'd disappear, and went back and forth between the borders, especially of Texas and Oklahoma. And in those days, the Texas police would have to stop at the border. And the people on the Oklahoma side, no, it wasn't a bank on our side, we don't care about them. And that went on and this was true. So Americans across the country in the 1930s followed this stuff. Bonnie and Clyde, they et cetera, et cetera. So it became a film and published in 1968. 1968 was the foundational year of the counterculture. And that in turn is a subculture within this country today, and spreading to Paris, spreading across Western Europe, and not within Russia. And so the Pussy Girls are part of the counterculture from 1968, which the Russians are still fighting. Okay. Conversation. Questions, commentaries. Yes.
I think there's a Russian
Yeah,
pop
we're gonna-
band. I think there's a Russian pop or punk. Actually, I think they're a punk band, and they're called Pussy Riot. Do you know if there's any affiliation between them and this countercultural group, Pussy Girls?
In detail, the answer is no.
No?
I mean, I can guess, but I don't know any detail of that, no.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure you could look it up on the web
Sure.
and tell us in 5 minutes from now if you want, or
Alright.
next session. And anything else you want to, that is, it illustrates what I mentioned briefly. There is a lot of, today, continuing ironic criticism or humorous teasing, including of Putin, including of that is not just the Westerners, of course, and we don't know how much is fake news, how much is made up completely, how much is partially true. It's all blended together, and the Russians are investing a huge amount in doing these kinds of things, and then they'll show something which is made in Italy or made in France about the leaders of Macron or the Italian leaders, and then in fact they may be, okay, we don't know if they may be Russian, they may be they're friends of that. I mean, I'm not trying to say it's goes down to just buying off people. They're people who are ideologically committed to this, they use humor in ways that as part of politics, but it goes back to the ancient Jews. It's a tradition. It's a tradition within religion to attack the hierarchy, and that kind of battle back and forth within towns, within Russia, within Israel, within China. In this course, we're looking for examples where we can find and measure differences across websites and so forth. But I'm trying not to, I mean, I can lecture on, but more questions or comments? You never thought of any of this stuff before? I bet you must have. Yes?
Has the perception in Russia changed about Mongolian culture affecting Russian culture?
Well, I mean, the quotes in there are compelling, that through the 19th century, the Russians ignored, as best they could, the Mongolians. They said, oh, it's just part of, I mean, it's just the Czar. The Czar did this. But where did the Czar learn how to do this?
And of the last 2 decades or 3 decades, have more Russians acknowledged Mongolian influence?
Yes, over the 20th century, later in the 20th century, there have been more serious Russian historians. That's what he's contrasting, name by name, and they're in the footnotes. He'll have the dates. But basically, in the 20th century, the Russian historians gradually recognized more seriously. Is this used by Putin? I mean, I haven't seen enough of Putin's speeches to answer with any sort of definitive manner, but he that is, he's using the arts, he's using himself, he's using the military prowess, and he says explicitly, we want to rebuild the Soviet model. You know, we want to bring back, and this is what excites people in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic. You know, they're part of the Soviet era. Okay. Questions? Yeah, comments?
I know that during the Obama administration, there was a lot of emphasis on like queer rights diplomacy. It's been called like rainbow diplomacy and everything, and that led to some like steeper hypermasculinity politics in Russia with I mean, a lot of the media and the the way that Putin portrayed himself, like in propaganda, shirtless on a horse, things like that. And so I guess my question is like, how do you think the current Trump administration and his sort of hypermasculinity politics are going to influence Russia, if at all, in terms of state performance?
They don't need Trump to have that in. I mean, Putin, as you said, Putin has been doing this for years. That when Putin first, well, his background was the KBG, but then, you know, then he was the leading figure in St. Petersburg, and then moved toward national politics. I had a student who did a master's thesis on Putin and Erdogan and how they both used visual imagery, especially of a tough, macho leader. And so Putin made a film called, I think it was Putin's Kiss, or it would be a kiss like, you know, to wake up this sleeping beauty and so forth. Putin had a calendar with pictures of him and videos in political campaigns that he would be riding a motorcycle with no shirt on, or he would driving a tank and waving his arms out, whatever, leading on with the tank, and thinks of, you know, pretty. That is, you don't need Trump if you've been doing this for 20 years or longer. But will that be where and how that will be featured? I don't know. I'm sure both Putin and Trump are thinking about it and are both trying to reach broader publics in ways that make each other, but who knows?
I guess a follow-up to that would be, do you think the way Trump is leaning into masculinity politics, do you think that signals a trend for the U.S. towards some similar, I mean, if not in ideology, but in like machismo state performance? Do you think that's something that the U.S. is going to continue along in the way that Russia has?
Good point, and I would say yes is the simple answer. But my follow-up beyond the simple one word is to say these things were not invented by one person, and they were there long before. And what Trump did, I mean, how was it in the last votes, the last week or two? How could those middle states, I mean, how did these middle states and those people who don't vote usually, maybe make a difference. And at least the journalistic crude data we have is younger black and younger men of especially Mexican and Latin and black background are fighting back against the feminization of the worlds around them. But that in their terms, and there's a lot of stuff which is already come out on that. But the reason I cite these crude labels such as young, I mean I live in Bronxville. I mean the look at, and I mentioned as well the lyrics of rap music and how two guys from Black Chicago created the Christian rap as a Christian egalitarian non-macho style of even within the rap music context illustrates the way how these are being playfully adapted and made fun of, but used by different subcultures. I mean, Orlando Patterson is a Harvard Jamaican background who writes about 4 black political cultures: middle class and lower status, middle status and lower status, and then men and women. So in those 4 types of political cultures, the lower status black women battling continually their sons, and their sons come back with labels about mother, etc., 4-letter words and so forth. That is, there's a culture of women getting along, lower status black women go to Baptist churches with their daughters, and their sons have a problem. That is, they don't have institutional places. I've had a couple of guys who've done PhDs in this, including Joseph Yee, who helped to develop our course here. It's called, I don't want to go too far afield, but he stresses the degree to which there is that is, he asks in the question, what do these young black men appeal to, and how can they find an institution if they don't know who their fathers are? Their mothers are kicking them out, or seem to be. They quit school. Gangs are one clear model, but he then finds 4 other institutions: martial arts, Soko Gakkai, which is a Japanese global Buddhist organization, a Amway, it's a thing linked to Amway, and the 4th is evangelical religion. Each of these, evangelical religion has often strong leaders, and so when he's presented this to workshops here, there are often people who are a little more close to feminist orientations. They find problems with his analysis. So I'm pointing to this because this goes back. This goes back well. This is not Trump. This goes back. It's broader. It's more general. But some of these people who may never have voted before voted for Trump. And so, as Trump points out, he won in all of those states, from Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and so forth, and completely surprised the media and the people from Massachusetts and California. Okay. So I would say gender, it's great to bring gender in and analyze how these issues are and being used or framed. We don't need to say, are they good or bad, or who is doing this, and are they, is it, but see, where and how do they, I mean, how do we look for products is what I'm suggesting we try to look at here. Look for something like Christian rap. Look for something like martial arts. And who goes to these, and where are they having impacts? These matter, and there are specific mechanisms that we can see working and making or fighting against globalization and localism and differences between Oakland versus Berkeley, etc. Okay. Thank you for raising discussion, and we'll go on Wednesday to pursue some of the same section.